yeah, the book very much is supposed to try and capture the spirit of ancient Greek philosophy. I think philosophy often feels like you're being given a whole bunch of balls to try and juggle in your head, as it were, and sometimes it does feel like that. But for the ancient Greeks, where Western philosophy is said to begin, it was as much about how you could engage with life so as to flourish and to expand, as it were, your sense of life. So it was as much about what has come to be known as spiritual exercises, as well as using the mind to think. So I'm going to try and say something about that, and hopefully present quite a different sense of what philosophy can be, or has been, compared to what it's often taken to be today, which I don't know about you, but perhaps rather alienated, sort of abstract, and of interest to the very few, hard to kind of make some sense of, or even why does it really matter? Whereas in the ancient world, people like the Stoics and the Epicureans, they were very widely followed. They were mass movements. So hopefully give you some sense of what that might have been about. Now this can be done in many ways, but one way of doing it is to wonder why this thing called philosophy gets going in around the 5th century, 6th century BC. And this is sometimes known as the Axial period. I don't know if you've heard of this expression before, but the idea is that in different civilizations, actually around the world, around the same time, a handful of figures pop up who seem to constellate or bring together big changes that were going on. And it's as if the world sort of turned a bit on its axis, so hence the phrase axial figures or axial age. And one of the chaps that's listed amongst these axial figures is Socrates, who's this kind of pivotal figure in ancient Greek philosophy. So we'll kind of come to Socrates, but take a step back before Socrates first of all, to try and get some sense of what might, what was so important about his times and then his life. What did he bring together in his life? And I'm quite influenced by a chap called Owen Barfield, who was a philologist, and he was in the same group of people as Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and he came up with an idea that one of the things which was happening was that people's consciousness was shifting at this time. People's experience of what it was to be human was changing, and it moved from the kind of experience of life which you can still get a taste of or a sense of in books by people like Homer, and then becomes something quite distinctively different in books by people like Plato. And he asked himself, what was this difference? And he thought that in Homer, the experience of being in the world was what he called a kind of participative consciousness. In Homer, there are many differences. I don't know if you ever read a bit of Homer. It's worth just getting a bit online and having a look. One very obvious thing is that Homer was very interested in a much more militaristic culture than subsequent figures like Plato, who's more interested in, for example, city-states. The virtues which are celebrated in Homer are militaristic virtues. So heroes in Homer, people like Achilles, and the question that really shapes the whole of Achilles' life is how to die honourably in war. This is different from the virtues that, for example, Aristotle comes to celebrate. He does have things like courage, but he also has virtues like prudence and temperance and justice, different kinds of virtues. And Barfield notices some of these changes and argues that in the Homeric period and before, people's experience of life was, as it were, to be swept along by fate. And the question that makes life meaningful is how to embrace your fate and to, as it were, impress the gods, impress those that demarcate fate in order to be celebrated. So figures like Achilles, the great heroes, are celebrated in that way. And what you see is that there's no great sense in Achilles, for example, of, him being an individual person. Homer doesn't think to ask much about what made Achilles the person he became. He doesn't ask about his mother and father, which is, immediately obvious to us now. He also notices that people don't have such a sense of what's inside and what's outside. in this participative period. So for example, in Homer, you can have a story, apparently a story about what's going on the battlefield, and then a miasma comes down, and immediately you kind of cut to the gods. There's a war going on in heaven, or there's a discussion going on Mount Olympus. And this sort of is hard to put together, certainly for the modern mind, whereas it presumably wasn't hard put together in Homer's time. It made immediate sense. And Barfield argues that that's because in the ancient world there wasn't such a keen sense of what's me and not me, what's inside and outside, and what's immortal and what's mortal. These worlds were completely immersed in one another, hence the phrase participative. What he argues is that for a number of reasons, socioeconomic reasons and others, this starts to change in maybe the 7th, 6th century BC, this axial period. And some of the things which we start to take for granted start to emerge. So for example, there becomes much stronger sense of what's me and what's not me. A sense of the individual starts to form. So Socrates, unlike Achilles, is definitely an individual. We know quite a lot about his personal history, for example, and we know that he fought in battles. We know something about his parents. We know that he was an aristocrat with limited means. We know he was married with children. We even have some sense of the character of his wife, and certainly some of the character of Socrates too. He becomes an individual, and with a sense of trying to, as it were, reach into the world in a way that Achilles never had to. Achilles assumed that he was being worked by the gods of the fates. Socrates, you start to get some of the sense which is more familiar, that meaning has to be worked at. What your destiny might be has to be kind of worked at in some way. There's a gap opens up. And I think it's with that sense of a gap between me and the world, between us and the good life, you might say, that's what starts to constellate and crystallise into what we now call philosophy. A set of problems about living start to emerge, which we still are familiar with. Let's just do a little experiment that perhaps sort of gets this in your guts as much as in your head. I said that I was trying to hope that philosophy, you can sort of feel your way into it as much as think your way into it. There's a pre-Socratic philosopher, so a philosopher that comes a century or so before Socrates, who's known as Anaximenes. For those who are interested in this, he's a Milesian philosopher. And he is remembered, apart from anything else, for performing experiments. And one of the experiments that he performs, we can do right now, which was that he blew on his hand. And he blew on his hand in two different ways. One with his mouth open, like that, and one with his lips pursed, like that. So have a go. Go back to the 6th century BC and a little philosophical moment. Mouth open, lips pursed, and what do you notice? There's no magic here. This is really quite straightforward. One is cold and one is warm. That's right. One is hot and one is cold. And presumably this is the kind of thing which countless people have done before. But it's not until Anaximenes that someone thinks to notice and to ask why. I guess that's what you're all now thinking. Why does this happen? This is a very modern kind of question to ask. The same thing could be said about Pythagoras. You may know that the story about Pythagoras was that he one day was walking past a blacksmith, heard that when the blacksmith banged the metal bar and then halved the metal bar and banged it again, the note leapt an octave. Now presumably countless people had heard this before, but Pythagoras thinks to notice and to wonder. So this is part of this sort of taking a bit of a step back from experience, thinking about what might be going on in the experience, and then as it were trying to reach back into the experience to carry on living. And that's the gap which I'm talking about. So Anaximenes blows on his hand, presumably loads of people have done that before, and he doesn't just kind of have the experience of it in a rather unthinking way. He thinks to ask what's going on there. Anyone know why? We want to know why, perhaps. Well, I can tell you now, with the benefits of modern physics, it's known as Boyle's law, in fact. And the idea is that when gases expand, they cool. And so when you blow on your hand with the lips pursed, there's high pressure inside, low pressure outside, and so the gas expands, the air expands, and it cools. But when you've got your mouth open, the temperatures inside and outside are roughly the same, so it comes out as body heat, so it feels warm. So refrigeration and all that is the same principle. this is the beginning of science, you might say, which has many, many advantages, like, for example, keeping things refrigerated. We don't need air conditioning this evening, but we can enjoy it at other times of the year. But with those advantages comes this disadvantage that we're, as it were, removed from our experience too. And so questions of meaning start to emerge. How can we, as it were, reach back into life? How can we reconnect with experience? Starts to become quite a pressing concern in this period. And then people like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the schools of the Hellenistic period, the Stoics, the Epicureans, they all start to devise ways of life which are kind of trainings to get the best of both worlds, to both understand nature, but also to be able to reconnect with the natural world, with the gods, with the cosmos. This starts the project of philosophy. Philosophy just meaning, I should say, literally means the love of wisdom. And philosophy in the philo bit is the kind of love that wants to befriend, that wants to know, that wants, as it were, to know it intimately, like you might know a friend, a very good friend, to have a sort of soulful connection, you might say. And then the wisdom doesn't so much mean like physics laws, like Boyle's law blowing on your hand. It means really the practical intelligence that knows how to live well in order to flourish. The one-word answer was develop virtues, these kind of characteristics, qualities of life which enable you to embrace life and to navigate it well, so that life, as it were, can flourish in you and you can flourish in this new experience of life that they all had. So that explains something, I think, about why this thing called philosophy even gets going and feels distinctive from what comes before. And the point about Socrates is that he seems, in his very life, his actual existence, to have brought this all together, to have constellated it. People met Socrates, and without even really quite knowing why, they felt both challenged in the sense of being disturbed, but also challenged in the sense of thinking, this guy somehow is opening something up for me too. It was both a frightening and an expansive experience to meet Socrates. We're told that he developed a kind of method to bring this experience about, this new experience of what it was to be human about, by asking simple questions. If you know any of Plato's dialogues, you know that they nearly all at least begin focused on a particular question, quite a simple question, like what is courage, what is friendship, what's justice. And these are kind of questions which, without thinking about it, we tend to assume we know, but very quickly start to unravel in our hands. We could do another exercise here, which you may have done in different contexts, which is to, in pairs, ask each other, who are you? You know, if you sort of kept saying to me, who are you? I might say Mark. I might say, you know, teach philosophy, work as a psychotherapist, live in South London. And very quickly I might sort of, I get a sense of something falling apart a bit, and I'd be reaching for something different and would be quite quickly thrown into a sense of doubt about my own identity, wondering who I was. And although it's an exercise and is false in that way, it does give you a sense of what it might have been like to meet Socrates, I think, that very quickly people seem to have been, as it were, thrown into the uncertainties of life. And many people didn't like that. He was known as the gadfly of Athens. Like the gadfly is like a horsefly that nips you, and it doesn't do you any permanent damage, but it irritates the hell out of you, and maybe bugs you in your mind much more than it actually does on the surface of your skin. And Socrates was called the gadfly because many people didn't like him. And if you know one thing about Socrates, you'll know that in 399 BC he was actually condemned to death and drank the hemlock and died. He'd made many enemies by that stage. He was an older man by then, about 69 years old. And there were enough enemies in this new democracy to kind of get together and to bring treasonous charges against him. And he died as a result. But there were enough people like Plato who, although they were deeply challenged by him, nonetheless wanted to sort of stick it out and try and work out what this new dispensation, this new experience of being alive that came together so much in this character Socrates, the spirit of Socrates, and develop it in various ways. The story about Plato goes that he was a budding writer, and as you may well know, the great playwrights of the time would get together at the Dionysian festival each year in Athens and have their plays performed to take the city through the ups and downs of life. And so Plato's going along to the Dionysian festival one year with his new play under his arm, but on his way he bumps into Socrates. And the story is, the myth is, which I think must capture some of the impact of the character of Socrates, that he there and then realised that he had only been sort of, as it were, pussyfooting around in terms of engaging with life by writing these great plays. And what he really needed to do was reorientate his life completely and follow this man, which he then did for the next 10, 15, 20 years or so until Socrates' death, and then sets up the academy, the first academy, in a grove, a sort of sacred park just outside the ancient city, and devotes the rest of his life to trying to develop what Socrates was about. You get this with these axial figures. The same's true with the Buddha, with Confucius, other characters like this. It wasn't what they all wrote nothing. We know that Socrates wrote nothing, and the others didn't write anything either. But the encounter with them led their followers to write books and books and books, trying to kind of grapple with what on earth was going on in this experience, and they come up with different ideas over the subsequent decades and centuries. So you have this sort of central figure of Socrates who releases this new spirit abroad, and it takes place at many different levels. Partly it is, what's the nature of the world, what's going on here in what we would now call physics. Aristotle coins the word and puts together a book called The Physics that tries to engage with things in these proto-scientific ways, like Anaximenes blowing on its hand. But they also realised that there was more at stake when you meet a character like Socrates than just the manifest presence of the man. He was seemed to be unleashing a new spirit into the world, and they got very interested in that as well. How could you characterise this new kind of energy, this new experience of life, this new consciousness? And so the subsequent schools get into that. We know Socrates must have been a very kind of alluring character. Some of the stories about him are these kind of more familiar stories about how he went around asking difficult questions, or simple questions that were very difficult to answer, and that provoked responses. But he also seemed to have had a mission from the god Apollo. One of the stories is that one of his friends went to the Delphic oracle and asked the oracle, was anyone... Well, we don't know quite what question he answered, actually, but the reply the oracle gave was, no one is wiser than Socrates, no one's wiser than he is. And Socrates wrestled with this question. He was a good follower of the ancient oracles, and the first thing you never did with an oracle was take it at face value. You had to kind of struggle with it and try and release what it was really going on about. And he realised that the key to his wisdom was actually how little he knew, rather than how much. He, as it were, was aware that human beings were what Plato subsequently called the in-between animal, and we were neither like the gods, who presumably kind of know it all, see clearly, don't ask questions, but neither are we like presumably most, if not all, other animals, who are more or less content, it seems, in their ignorance. They just, as it were, get on with life in a more instinctive kind of way. Whether or not that's true of all animals, you can debate, but we human beings certainly are aware of our ignorance and our uncertainty as much as what we do know as well. And Socrates realised that the key to wisdom is to appreciate that balance, and to try to be able to tolerate what's unknown as much as what is known. And Plato puts it together in his interest in the force which he called love, the force eros. And many of his dialogues are engaged with how this quest, this desire for more that we human beings are driven by, how it can both make us and break us. It's kind of the key to our flourishing as much as the key to our destruction. And how we can, as it were, channel this force, this god. In one point in the symposium, Plato actually speculates that Socrates was a kind of personification of the god Eros. Such was the sort of power, as it were, of his presence to those who could appreciate it. And he thought that qualities like sympathy with the world, cultivating and training yourself so that you had more and more of a kind of natural resonance with the world, was one way of doing it. Becoming keener with qualities like beauty, could you be drawn towards things that are beautiful, not just on the surface, but appreciate kind of deeper quality of beauty, and that would take you towards the divine. And this is why he gets very interested in reason, because he feels that reason engages a hidden part of us, which can develop more and more, as it were, sophisticated ways of appreciating what sophisticated forms of beauty might be like. So reason doesn't just mean logic. You'll know that it's related to the word ratio, like ratio. And so it has a kind of aesthetic, harmonious kind of quality too. It's about kind of symmetries, hidden balances and exchanges and so on, as much as it's about putting down a good logical argument, as we tend to think of it now. So the good philosopher isn't just a person who's kind of good with his mind. His soul too is able to resonate and find a way through the ups and downs of life, the unknowns of life, the stuff that life throws at us, in order to reconnect with the cosmos and find a way back to the divine, this gap that had opened up in that period, and which we now, I think, feel very, very keenly indeed. I'll come to an end shortly and we can have questions and discussion, I hope very much. But maybe just to say a little bit about what happens after Socrates' death and after Plato, because a range of schools open up that are familiar to us now probably. Things like the Stoics, the Epicureans, a bit less well known, the Skeptics and the Cynics. And in a way they're all different responses to Socrates, to this moment of realising we need new ways of life in order to engage with life. The Stoics think that really the key issue is our emotional hubbub, the emotional ups and downs of the everyday, which can pull us this way and that. And so they develop ways of learning how to respond more wisely to the emotional hubbub. And they argue that if you can do that, taking a kind of step back from the emotional ups and downs, then what you realise is that there's a deeper kind of pulse of life which runs through all things, which they call the logos. They didn't, as it were, make up the logos. The logos had been discussed before in the pre-Socratic period, but they felt that this way of life which they were developing enabled you to get more in touch with the logos, and so live from the life of the logos, which was the divine life in the world, in the cosmos, rather than, as it were, being swept along by the ups and downs of the everyday. But again, it takes a training. It's a way of life. You would become a Stoic and try and train by Stoic principles for many, many years. They were more like monks and nuns than they were like modern philosophers in that sense. So that was the way that they felt we need to engage with life, so that you can take pleasure in small things and not be overwhelmed by pain in life. And so they were hedonists, not in the sense of more and more and more pleasures. They thought that was a complete disaster. But can you genuinely take pleasure in small things? And then this opens you up to a different perception of the cosmos. They argued that the cosmos was very different from the Stoics, but nonetheless it was a sort of training in order to open your heart and mind to that. The Skeptics are different again. Skeptic doesn't mean what it means today. It didn't mean going around debunking other people's beliefs. Skepsis just means searcher or inquirer. And they felt the key thing that we human beings need to do is to loosen ourselves from what we believe to be the case, from our own stories. And if we can enter that unknown place, then something new might emerge in that unknown place. I was mentioning before we started that I think psychotherapy too is quite like ancient philosophy, and the Skeptics very much the link there, that psychotherapy in its different manifestations is all about trying to loosen yourself from your tight grip, your attachment, you might say, to what you believe to be the case. And in loosening the grip, something new can emerge, and that's often the source of movement and change, and perhaps even healing. So the Skeptics are trying to develop ways of life to partly tolerate the unknown, but also to engage with the unknown. And they too have quite a long tradition coming up into the modern world as well. So I hope that gives you some sense of what ancient philosophy is really about. They seem to have had this sense that the world has shifted for socioeconomic reasons, for reasons of starting to ask why. I think even writing had a profound impact on human consciousness. You know, if you think about it, an oral culture is a culture that emerges from the heart. It's very participative. Stories must have felt like they flowed through you. Writing had been around for quite a while before the figures like Socrates and Plato, but it's about that time that this oral culture starts to get written down. And when you have something written on a page in front of you, it's like it has a life of its own. Is it where it exists without you engaging with it, and then you have to sort of try and engage with it to really get a sense of what the words mean. It's a very different kind of experience of consciousness that starts to value writing in that way. It has great advantages because a lot of stuff can be written down and preserved, and you can engage with things in different ways than you can in an oral culture. But it has this experience that meaning starts to feel a bit distant from you. How am I going to get, as it were, back into the words? How am I going to close this gap? And that's what ancient philosophy seems to have really been about. Constellated in the figure of Socrates, for whom just to meet him seems to have provoked this massive range of responses. But luckily for us, individuals like Plato, and then the Stoics, the Epicureans and others really struggled and wrestled with to try and engage with and come up with, really importantly, ways of life as well as ideas. Because they knew that unless you yourself, unless we actually change, we won't be able to resonate with the cosmos. We won't be able to receive these insights, this knowledge. We need to become more akin to the divine in order that that can be awakened and known within us. A key way in which I think ancient philosophy certainly at least feels quite different from often modern perception of things. So I could carry on talking about this, but I hope that gives you sort of a sketch and a feel for it, and maybe you've got questions fleshing stuff out, or what about this guy I've heard about, or a range of stuff, and hopefully we can talk a little bit more. Yeah, no, sorry, that's good. I thought I was running out of time, but I'll bring back the Cynics. So they had a different idea about how to really pick up the Socratic spirit. They were called Cynics not because they were cynical. Again, it's a bit like the Skeptics weren't skeptical, the Stoics weren't stoical. These meanings have got shifted. The Cynics were known as the Cynics because they lived like dogs, and cynic comes from the Greek word for dog. And it was an accusation. They were told, you live like dogs. And so they said, okay, we'll call ourselves the Cynics then. And they thought the key issue for human beings, the first, as it were, step into a deeper sense of life, was to challenge convention. And they thought that human beings our liberation is thwarted by our conventions. So, you know, what we wear, what we eat, when we sleep, how we want to sleep, what we want to gather around us, use of money, politics that traps us, all these kind of human conventions. And so their way of dealing with that was to try and shock people out of convention. So hence they did things which dogs did. Use your imagination. A lot of things in public which we wouldn't dare to do, and dogs did do. So hence the kind of accusation, but then they embraced that. And what seems to have happened is that they were never a mass movement like the Stoics and the Epicureans, but it's almost as if in every generation a key cynic was remembered over the next few centuries. And they were like sort of prophets who would challenge people against their complacency through their performances of various kinds, and they developed all sorts of strategies over the centuries to try and keep people not just, as it were, being swept along by convention. And in fact, some people have argued that actually Jesus might have been very influenced by the Cynics, because a lot of his phrases sound a bit like the Cynic tradition. So things like give no thought for the morrow, consider the birds of the air and the lilies of the field, are they not clothed in more glory than Solomon in his temple? Phrases like this have that kind of cynic quality. Are you missing out on something really important by these conventional ways of living that we human beings fall into so easily? So they're a really important school as well, but not such a mass movement.
Which one do you think you would fall under?
Personally, I'm most influenced by Plato and by the Platonist tradition. Plato sets up his academy 5th century BC, and it then carries on for many, many years. It's finally closed down in 529 AD, 900 years later. So it's gone through a lot of changes in that time, and in particular there was a very important movement in the 2nd century AD, which we now call Neoplatonism. Plotinus and those characters at that time, they just thought they were followers of Plato. The word Neoplatonism is a modern way of trying to label it. And it got very integrated with Stoicism and then also with Christianity. Christianity, when the Jesus moment happens, a bit like the Socrates moment, people sit around for quite a long time thinking, what on earth was that about? And they draw a lot on Platonic ideas and Stoic ideas too. Whether what you're picking up on there is one of Plato's dialogues called the Republic. And if anyone knows anything about the Republic, they know that in that Socrates says that poets should be banned from the city-state. Yeah, yeah. So this enables me to get onto a bit of my hobby horse, because I think Plato always wrote dialogues, and we know he only wrote dialogues, about 30 or so. And what the point about a dialogue is it asks you to wrestle with ideas, not to, as it were, read it like a creed. This is what I think we must do. A, B, C, ban the poets. So what he's doing in the Republic, amongst many other things, it's an immensely rich dialogue, and the poet bit is just one part of it, is to ask, what do poets actually do in society? And this is where some of the critique comes in, that he felt that poets are wizards with words. They move people, they can open, the imagination, open the heart. They can close things down. They can provoke all sorts of emotion and responses and so on. So the question is, to what ends are they using their ability, using their skills? And in the Republic, he argues that they should be using them to the greater good. And he argues that part of what's going wrong in this democracy, because he lives in the period of the democracy, is what happens in democracies often is that people can be swayed by the masses rather than really moving wisely in this democracy. And so the poets are just the kind of the clever users of words. In part, the writings of tabloid headlines are kind of poets in that sense. They're high impact, but they drag you in a particular direction, you might say. So that's what he's questioning. But there's another side to it, which is the more spiritual side to it too, because I think the poets can be thought of as the closest to kind of priests in the ancient world. The word priests in the temple that perform the rituals, but priests as we often mean it now are the kind of guardians of what we're supposed to think theologically. And so poets like Homer, you're right when you were talking there as well, they transmit ideas about the gods. And the philosophers too question that a lot. So for example, they were never against popular religion. Socrates is depicting as making libations, going to the temple, uttering the prayers, doing all that sort of thing, the popular religion you might say. But they felt that it was really important in this discernment process, this training, to realise that these were just sort of multiple ways of trying to get to something behind the forms, which was, in Plato's conception anyway, a deeper perception of what he called the good, the beautiful and the true. And so poets that just, as it were, wreak havoc with popular religiosity, and don't, as it were, try and help people train themselves to perceive the deeper sense of things behind the popular rituals, are suspect by Plato. And so he both criticises that, but also in fact tries to come up with new myths himself. So you may well know that Plato's the originator of the myth of Atlantis, for example, so far as we know. So he did value myths and poetry. He's a great, as Greek speakers will know, a great writer in ancient Greek as well. He was a poet. But he's trying to come up with new ways of engaging in these kind of forms that help people gain a perception of what he calls the good, the beautiful and the true. So, you wrestle with his dialogues, and they unsettle you and they unsteady you, and you wonder what earth is going on, what it's about. But that's a kind of process of purification, you might say, that is working on your soul as much as in your head, in order that through your engagement you get glimpses of these other, the deeper truths, the good, the beautiful and the true, for want of a better expression. It's a really fascinating question, because one of the charges at Socrates' trial is that he introduced new gods to the city. And this was a treasonous offence, partly because for a lot of Socrates' life, Athens was at war with Sparta. and so the gods that you, as it were, honoured were a sign of your citizenship and so on. So that's why it's a treasonous charge with the death penalty attached to it. But when he's convicted of these charges, he's sitting in his prison cell, and he could have escaped at that point. He was convicted during a particular festival where people couldn't be put to death during the festival, and some of his followers do say, look, we could bribe the guards, and it was, it wasn't, you could go into exile, quite an easy thing to do. And he says he's not going to do that. And one of the ways of understanding that is that he had a principle, and he realised that the manner of his death was in a way the judgment of his whole life, what he'd stood for. This quest for what's good, beautiful and true, and the virtuous life, guarding his soul, as he often says. And if, as it were, he flunked it at the last minute, it would call into question this transformation which he felt had come about. But it's the way that Socrates often talked about it was not kind of principle or conscience, as we would say. He listened to what he called his demon. He's well attested to have had a kind of inner voice, which he called his demon. And it's a really fascinating phenomenon, this, because the demon always tells him what not to do. It sometimes was quite trivial things like don't turn left, and he would turn right, and he would have some fruitful encounter as a result. But perhaps the most sort of poignant moment was when he was in prison awaiting the hemlock, and the demon says don't leave. And he comes to understand that as, this is, as it were, the most important moment in your life. But I think it's very interesting, this negative way of the demon, because Socrates, as I was mentioning before, is if he's sure of one thing, is that we live in, as it were, seas of uncertainty. We can, as it were, taste immortality, but we're mortals. We have a sort of yearning for the infinite, but we're finite. We long to see the good, the beautiful and the true, and yet we know there's pain and mess all around. So we live not knowing quite where we're going, you might say. So this demon always says, don't do this, don't do that. But in the navigating his way through that, his life expands and grows, and he becomes convinced of the immortal part of his soul that will see him through his death in some way. He's not quite sure, but will see him through his death in some way. He knows, as it were, eternity in this life, you might say.
So it was a conviction as opposed to a principle.
Yeah, it was a trust in this demon, actually. He had come to trust that it would show him the right way, even though he didn't quite understand the goal. And I think that for me is a very human kind of experience. If you follow a path or follow a demon, you work on your training, you try and inculcate the virtues, you try and, as it were, work on this change of yourself, but you have to sort of trust quite where it's going to lead. I suppose if you knew the goal, you wouldn't have to do the work. You would already be there, in a way, you might say. So this negative way is very much part of the human experience, I personally think. And so
on the extreme, and much later on, of course, you'd end up following the steps of Dr. D, wouldn't you? In that?
Well, alchemy is very interesting, because I think one of the things which alchemy is on the cusp of is, do I know a positive way that can, as it were, I have the secret of the philosopher's stone, can make the alchemical gold, or are we human? Is that sort of blasphemous? This is one of some of the debates that go on in alchemy, because it's claimed to be a god already, and is actually the human path to be somewhere in the known and the unknown, and so you get this more spiritual form of alchemy too, which is about, as it were, working on yourself. The philosopher's stone is inside rather than outside, sort of known and grasped in human hands. Yeah, so it's a very, very rich kind of train of thought in the tradition. Yeah.
So Mark, how do you...
Question, two parts. The quick answer is they did use all those other things. So, for example, Plato writes quite a lot about music. And Socrates at one point says, "I should have learnt to play the flute." And we know they had practices of meditation, what we would now call visualizations. What you ate and drank, all these things were kind of considered by the different schools. The rhythm of life that you led, encounters with other people were actually absolutely crucial. My PhD was actually on the importance of friendship in Plato, because he thought that it was only really through encounters with a friend that you could trust, that you could open your heart to, that you could really take risks with, that you could do this thing called philosophy. that you could engage in this transformation. But perhaps also to add that the mind was a more expansive notion than we perhaps tend to think of it now too. So the mind really was your consciousness, your awareness, what you could perceive, and that was partly done through reason in a more narrow sense. But you know, if you read Plato's dialogues, there's myths in them. He quite often talks about where they are. You know, so in one of the dialogues they go out by a stream, and Socrates says, "Oh, I always get a bit nervous by flowing water. You never know what spirits are lurking. You know, what's going to happen to us today? Are we safe here?" You know, there's a lot more in the words. They're poems, so they affect the heart as much as this sort of strict reason and logic. If you picked up the Parmenides, that's probably the most logical, narrow kind of does A follow B kind of dialogue. But you pick up ones like the Symposium, they're about love, and they're...
What words do they use for the mind?
The word's nous.
And for the soul, psyche.
Yeah, psyche, yeah.
So they differentiate between the two.
Yeah, they tend to have a tripartite notion: the body, the soul, and the nous. So the soma, the psyche, and the nous. And again, they all mean slightly different things. Body doesn't mean what we tend to mean now, sort of like biological body. It just means the manifest presence, the thing that you can see with the senses. That's what they meant by body. So if I said to you, "There's a body over there," you'd think I meant like a dead bit of flesh. For Plato to say there's a body over there means there's the manifest presence of a psyche and a nous as well. It's just what you can, as it were, see with your eyes or touch. But that's just the manifestation of the soul, which is the lively, vital part of what it is to be human. The part that has some freedom and that can use the will, make intentions, follow paths. That's the soma. And then the nous, just to finish it, the nous is the bit that's most in touch with the eternal side of things. It's the most divine-like part of ourselves.
The soul corresponds with the emotions.
Yeah, well, the emotions might affect, you know, the body. The flushes of the body would be emotions, but so too would be the sort of the more inner movements, which would affect the soul. So to train yourself in a Stoic way to understand your emotions is both a physical and a spiritual thing. Yeah.
Just say we've got time for maybe one more question.
Oh, okay. Yeah. He is remaking a tradition for this new experience of life. He's trying to keep the tradition alive, you might say. So he is explicitly very influenced by Pythagoreanism, for example, which was a pre-Socratic tradition and definitely connected with Egypt. The Skeptics, in their suspension of what you know, are directly influenced by Indian philosophies as well. And I think there's a much more of a mix. Remember that, you know, Greece is, as it were, as we now think of it, on the you'll know this, on the you know, both the north and the south in terms of Macedon and Egypt, but the east and the west in terms of Europe and India, and maybe even further afield. These ancient traditions, or they were all engaging with the same reality. So we all, with that, you see commonalities. It's not so surprising, because it's all different attempts perhaps to engage with the same reality ultimately. But I'm sure there's mixing of traditions as well as trying to keep traditions alive by new invention, new ways of thinking, new practices as well. It's got to be both and, otherwise things just die.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark.
Great.